Jenna, living in the city, doing my thing. Got a decent job in marketing, nothing spectacular, but it pays the bills for my overpriced apartment. Consider myself pretty aware of the world, you know? I read, I stay informed, I have strong opinions about social justice. My best friend, Aeneas, is on the same wavelength. We spend a lot of time together, mostly grabbing coffee and talking about how messed up everything is. So, a few months back, maybe it was a Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon, we were at our usual spot. It's one of those generic minimalist coffee shops with light wood furniture and ridiculously expensive oat milk lattes. I was scrolling through some news site on my laptop, just killing time before a late meeting. Anais was doing the same on her phone. The place was pretty quiet, just the low hum of the espresso machine and some guy typing loudly on his keyboard. I came across this article, a think piece about the rise of MGTOW. The headline was something dramatic, like "The Silent Retreat of Men and Why It's a Red Flag for Society." I chuckled and turned the laptop toward Aeneas. She leaned over, read the headline, and rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. I started reading parts of it out loud, doing a dramatic, whiny voice for effect. The article was talking about men who were supposedly going their own way, focusing on themselves instead of pursuing relationships. It tried to be balanced, talking about societal pressures, but it was easy to read between the lines. To us, it just sounded like a bunch of guys who couldn't handle rejection and decided to throw a collective tantrum. I read a quote from some guy in the article: "I'm investing in my own happiness now, not in a system that's rigged against me." Aeneas snorted into her coffee. She said it was the most pathetic cope she'd ever heard. It's not that the system is rigged, it's that their personalities are terrible. I agreed, adding that it was just weaponized mediocrity. They couldn't compete, so they were taking their ball and going home. We started riffing on it, getting louder, not really caring if anyone heard, imagining what their lives must be like. Probably basements filled with empty energy drink cans and dirty laundry, spending all their time online, complaining about women in some echo chamber. The author of the article was trying to paint it as some kind of complex social phenomenon. We saw it as peak toxic masculinity, just curdled into a new, sadder form. Instead of being aggressive and loud, it was passive-aggressive and sulking. Aeneas said she'd rather deal with an outright jerk than one of these guys who wallow in self-pity. At least the jerk is honest about who he is. We were having a good laugh at their expense. It felt righteous in a way. We were punching up at a group of men who clearly had a problem with women like us. Confident, independent women who don't need a man to validate them. The whole conversation probably lasted 20 minutes. We were about to close the laptop and talk about something else when Anais suddenly stopped scrolling on her phone. She held it up, her expression a mix of amusement and disbelief. It was a picture on some social media feed. 4 guys standing in front of what looked like a large, open garage door. They were all smiling, looking relaxed. But Aeneas was pointing at one guy in particular. He was standing slightly to the side, leaning against the frame. He looked familiar. Then it clicked. It was Dorian. We hadn't seen or heard from him since we all left college years ago. Dorian was the definition of a nice guy back then, not in a good way. He was always just around. Part of our wider social circle, but never really in the inner sanctum. He was the guy you'd call if you needed help moving a couch, or if your car battery died. Dependable, eager to please, and completely non-threatening. He'd linger after everyone else had left a party, trying to make conversation. He clearly had a crush on me for a while, then on Anais, but he never had the nerve to do anything about it. We just saw him as this harmless, slightly awkward satellite, a permanent resident of the friend zone. Looking at the picture, he was different. He wasn't the skinny, slightly hunched-over guy we remembered. His shoulders were broader, his posture was straight. He had a calm confidence in his eyes that was completely new. Aeneas zoomed in on the photo. The other guys looked formidable too. One was built like a lumberjack. Another looked like a tech nerd who actually lifted weights. The fourth one had a sharp, intense look, like a wolf in a suit. They all looked like they were in their early 30s, a few years older than us. The caption on the post was simple, something like, "Project HQ coming along nicely." It was posted by one of the other guys in the photo, David, the big one. I felt a strange jolt. Seeing Dorian, of all people, looking like that, it didn't compute. Aeneas, ever the pot stirrer, said the first thing that came to her mind. I bet he's one of them, one of those MGTOW guys. The idea was so absurd that I burst out laughing. Dorian, the ultimate people pleaser, the guy who would apologize if you bumped into him, joining a movement of men who supposedly hate women? It was impossible, but the more I thought about it, the more the idea burrowed into my brain. He had dropped off the face of the earth after college. No texts, no awkward social media comments. Just gone. Maybe something snapped in him. Maybe all those years of being the nice guy and getting nowhere finally broke him. A wicked little idea started to form in my head. It was perfect. I looked at Anais, a grin spreading across my face. I told her we had to find out. We had to see this for ourselves. It would be a social experiment, a field trip. We would go on a little safari to observe the sad, self-exiled male in his natural habitat. The sheer comedic potential was too good to pass up. Anais loved the idea immediately. Her eyes lit up with the promise of drama. Our mission was clear. Find Dorian and his merry band of rejected men and see what their MGTOW lifestyle really looked like. We expected a tragedy, but we were ready to play it as a comedy. Finding them wasn't even that hard. Anais, who has skills that could land her a job at the CIA, went to work. The guy who posted the photo, David, had a business page linked in his profile. It was for custom furniture, high-end, expensive-looking stuff. The page had an address listed for a workshop. It was on the industrial outskirts of the city, about a 40-minute drive from us. Perfect. We planned it for the following Saturday. The drive over was filled with jokes and speculation. We built up this whole narrative in our heads. We'd show up and find them sitting on milk crates, playing video games on a dusty TV. The air would be thick with the smell of stale pizza and despair. Maybe they'd have a whiteboard with a list of rules for their man club, like no girls allowed, and rule number 1, complain about the friend zone. We'd pretend we were lost, or that we were looking for a different business. We'd act all sweet and innocent just to see their reaction. Would they be hostile? Awkward? Would they try to preach their weird gospel to us? I had my phone ready to surreptitiously record a few video clips for our private group chat. The anticipation was delicious. It felt like we were about to pull the curtain back and expose the whole thing for the pathetic sham we knew it was. As we got closer, the scenery changed. The trendy cafes and boutiques gave way to warehouses, chain-link fences, and rows of identical-looking business units. The GPS told us to turn into a newly developed complex. It was surprisingly clean and modern, not the grimy, run-down industrial park I had pictured. We found the unit number. My heart started beating a little faster. The moment of truth was here. We parked the car a short distance away, watching. The front of the unit was a large, frosted glass door, and an even larger, sleek black roll-up garage door. It looked more like a trendy tech startup than a dusty workshop. There was no sign of life from the outside. Maybe they weren't there. Just as I was about to suggest we leave, the big roll-up door started to move. It rose smoothly and silently, revealing the inside. And we just sat there in the car, mouths slightly agape. It was not what we expected, not even close. The space inside was huge, bright, and impeccably organized. It looked like something out of a magazine. One entire wall was exposed brick. The other was clean white drywall. The polished concrete floor shone under the bright overhead lights. The space was divided into distinct zones. On the left, there was a full-blown, professional-grade gym. A squat rack, dumbbells arranged in perfect order of weight. A heavy bag, a rowing machine. It was cleaner than most commercial gyms I'd been to. On the right was the workshop area, but it was pristine. A massive workbench stood in the center, and various high-tech saws and sanders were positioned neatly against the wall. There were no piles of sawdust, just a few wood shavings around the workbench. And in the back, there was a lounge area with a leather sofa, a large coffee table, and a massive wall-mounted screen displaying stock market charts. A sleek minimalist kitchen was tucked into one corner. This wasn't a sad man cave. This was a headquarters, a command center. And then we saw them. The 4 of them were there, each engrossed in his own task. David, the big guy, was in the workshop area. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and safety glasses, focused on a massive slab of dark wood on the workbench. He moved with a quiet confidence, his movements precise and efficient. He wasn't just a brute, he was a craftsman. In the tech corner, a guy we later learned was named Gustav was sitting in front of a 3-monitor setup. He had headphones on, and his fingers were flying across the keyboard. He was completely in the zone, building some kind of digital world. By the stock market screen, the intense-looking one, Fisher, was on the phone. He was pacing slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice, but his words carried an authority that was unmistakable. He was talking numbers, percentages, and market caps. And then there was Dorian. He was in the gym area. He was finishing a set of pull-ups. His back muscles moved under his shirt, and he lowered himself with controlled strength. There was no grunting, no showing off, just disciplined effort. He grabbed a towel, wiped his face, and took a sip from a water bottle. He then walked over to a large whiteboard that was covered in what looked like project plans and timelines. He picked up a marker and added a note, his expression focused and serious. Aeneas and I looked at each other. The entire comedic narrative we had constructed on the drive over evaporated in an instant. This was not funny. This was intimidating. We were the ones who felt out of place. 2 girls in a Prius about to interrupt a group of men who were clearly building an empire. Aeneas wanted to leave. She whispered that this was a bad idea, but my pride wouldn't let me back down. I had to see this through. I had to understand what was going on. I got out of the car, smoothed down my dress, and told Aeneas to come on. We walked towards the open door, the sound of our footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet complex. As we reached the entrance, Dorian turned from the whiteboard. His eyes met mine. There was a flicker of recognition, but nothing else. No surprise, no awkwardness, no hint of the eager-to-please guy from college. He just looked at us, his expression neutral, waiting. I was the one who felt awkward. I opened my mouth, the sarcastic, "Are we interrupting your secret man meeting?" dying on my lips. Instead, I just said his name. "Dorian?" He nodded slowly. "Jenna, Aeneas, it's been a long time." His voice was deeper than I remembered, calmer. The other guys had noticed us by now. David turned off his sander, the sudden silence making the space feel even larger. Gustav took off his headphones. Fisher ended his call with a polite but firm, "I'll call you back." 4 pairs of eyes were on us. They weren't hostile. They weren't welcoming. They were just observing, analyzing. It was the most unnerving feeling. I felt like I was being scanned for a purpose, and I didn't have one. Aeneas was hiding behind me, completely silent. I had to say something. I fell back on our pre-planned excuse. We were just in the area, and we saw the open door. We thought this was a different place. It sounded so lame, even to my own ears. Dorian didn't even bother to call out the lie. He just gestured vaguely to the space. "This is our workshop." A simple statement of fact. I pushed forward, trying to regain some of the smug confidence I'd felt in the coffee shop. "Wow, this is quite the setup you've got here. A gym, a workshop. What exactly is this place?" It was David who answered, his voice a low rumble. "It's where we work." Aeneas, finding a sliver of courage, piped up with one of our rehearsed lines. "So, this is what you guys do all day? Just hang out and lift weights and play with wood?" The condescension in her tone was obvious. Fisher, the intense one, stepped forward slightly. He didn't smile. Gustav's app is projected to hit a 7-figure valuation by the end of the year. David's custom furniture has a 6-month waiting list, with clients from all over the country. I manage a portfolio of our collective investments that has outperformed the S&P 500 for the last 3 years. And Dorian oversees the logistics of it all. He paused, letting the information sink in. "So, no, we don't just hang out?" The air was thick with our humiliation. Every word he said was a direct refutation of the narrative we had so gleefully constructed. These weren't failed men hiding from the world. These were successful men who had built their own world. I felt a desperate need to find a crack in their armor, to find the bitterness, the resentment that had to be there. This whole thing had to be a response to women, to us. I looked directly at Dorian, making it personal. "So, this is it then? This is your grand statement? Build a fortress and prove you don't need women?" I wanted to provoke him, to see the hurt, angry guy I knew was buried under that calm exterior. I wanted him to lash out, to complain about how unfair dating was, to confirm our theories. But he didn't. He just looked at me with an expression that was almost pity. It was the last thing I expected. and it was the most infuriating. "This has nothing to do with proving anything to anyone, Jenna," he said, his voice even. "We're not building a fortress against women. We're building a foundation for ourselves." He gestured around the workshop again. We realized we were spending all our energy trying to play a game we couldn't win. A game where the rules were always changing and the finish line kept moving. He looked from me to Anais. We were chasing things we were told we should want, a certain kind of approval, a specific type of relationship, a life that fit a pre-written script, and it was making us miserable, weak, and broke. "So we quit the game," he continued. "We decided to create our own, with our own rules, our own goals, and our own definitions of success." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "This isn't about bitterness, it's about freedom. It's about building tangible value in our skills, in our finances, in our friendships." His words hit me like a physical blow, because in that moment, I saw the stark contrast between their lives and mine. They were building assets, skills, and wealth. I was building a social media presence and a collection of witty complaints about the patriarchy. They were calm, focused, and purposeful. I was anxious, distracted, and constantly seeking validation from the very system I claimed to despise. The final crushing blow was their indifference. After Dorian finished speaking, they just went back to what they were doing. David turned his sander back on. Gustav put his headphones on. Fisher picked up his phone. Dorian gave us a final polite nod and turned back to his whiteboard. The conversation was over. We were dismissed, not with anger or yelling, but with the quiet, devastating message that we were irrelevant to their world. We weren't even important enough to be enemies. We were just a minor, momentary distraction. Anais and I just stood there for a few seconds in stunned silence. Then we turned and walked out. The drive back was completely silent. The smug jokes and laughter were gone, replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable quiet. The safari was a catastrophic failure. We hadn't found what we were looking for. We had found the exact opposite. And in doing so, we had found something deeply unsettling about ourselves. The silence in the car was a physical thing. It was so heavy I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. All our smug energy, all our righteous certainty, had been sucked out of us and left a vacuum. We drove for maybe 15 minutes before Anais finally spoke. Her voice was small, hesitant. She tried to rationalize it, to put what we saw back into a box we could understand. She said it was probably all a front, that it was all for show, a desperate attempt to look successful because they were so empty inside. She theorized that it was all funded by family money, that they were just playing at being productive, like rich kids with a trust fund, anything to make it less real, anything to make them pathetic again. I didn't say anything. I just kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, because I didn't believe her. And I think she knew it. You can't fake the kind of quiet focus they had. You can't fake the calluses on a man's hands or the look of intense concentration of someone deep in their work. There was no performance. In fact, the most devastating part was that they didn't seem to care if we were there or not. We weren't the audience. We had just stumbled onto their stage by mistake. When Anais saw I wasn't agreeing with her, she got defensive. Her tone shifted from rationalization to anger. She started talking about how arrogant they were, how their little speech about quitting the game was just sour grapes. She said Dorian was clearly still bitter about being rejected all those years ago, that this whole elaborate setup was just the world's most over-the-top revenge fantasy. I still didn't respond. I dropped her off at her apartment with a quiet, "See you later," and drove home. My own apartment, which I usually saw as my stylish, independent sanctuary, suddenly felt different. It felt flimsy, temporary. It was filled with things I'd bought to create an image. The trendy art prints on the wall, the expensive throw pillows, the bookshelf filled with books I'd only half read, but looked good as a backdrop for video calls. It was all decoration. It was a stage set for a life I was pretending to have. I thought about their workshop. Everything in that space had a purpose. The gym equipment was for building strength. The tools were for creating tangible objects of value. The computers were for building digital products. The stock charts were for growing wealth. It was a place of production. My apartment was a place of consumption. Dorian's words echoed in my head. We were spending all our energy trying to play a game we couldn't win. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the game, and I started to see it everywhere. my job in marketing was the game. My whole career was about convincing people to buy things they didn't need to project an image to people they didn't know. It was about manufacturing desire and insecurity. My social life was the game. Going to the right brunch spots, posting the perfectly curated photos, crafting witty, sarcastic captions that showed how clever and detached I was. My dating life was the absolute final boss of the game, swiping through hundreds of faces on apps, trying to present the most appealing version of myself. Going on dates that felt like job interviews, both of us trying to sell ourselves while simultaneously looking for flaws in the other person. It was all a performance, a massive, exhausting, expensive performance. And what was the prize for winning? A partner who was also playing the game? A slightly nicer apartment? More likes? It suddenly felt like a hollow victory. The next few weeks were strange. It was like a switch had been flipped in my brain. I started seeing everything through this new filter. At work, during a meeting, one of my female bosses was talking about a new campaign. She used a lot of buzzwords like empowerment and authenticity to describe a product that was basically just a new brand of flavored water. A year ago, I would have nodded along, inspired. Now, it just sounded like meaningless noise. I looked at the male employees in the room. They were silent, nodding politely. I used to interpret that silence as them being disengaged or complicit in their privilege. Now, I saw it as exhaustion. They were just trying to survive the meeting without saying the wrong thing and getting called into HR. They had already quit the game, at least emotionally. They were just showing up to collect a paycheck. My friendship with Anais started to feel the strain. She kept trying to bring up Dorian and his friends, her tone always dripping with mockery. She had settled on a narrative she liked. They were a cult of sad men who were afraid of strong women. It was her coping mechanism. It allowed her to dismiss them and feel superior again. One evening we were out with a few other friends. Anais was telling the story, embellishing it for comedic effect. She described the men as weird survivalists, probably prepping for the apocalypse. Everyone laughed, but I didn't. I just quietly stirred my drink. Anais noticed. Later, when we were alone, she confronted me about it. She asked why I was being so quiet, why I didn't back her up. I told her I just didn't think it was that funny. I said that, honestly, what they were doing was kind of impressive. She looked at me like I had just grown a second head. She accused me of being brainwashed. She asked if I had a crush on Dorian now that he had muscles. Her arguments were all personal attacks, because she couldn't attack the substance of what they'd built. The conversation got heated. I tried to explain my perspective. I told her I was just tired of the constant outrage, the constant complaining. I asked her, what are we actually building, besides a list of grievances? That was the wrong thing to say. She said I was internalizing misogyny, that I was betraying the cause by sympathizing with the other side. The conversation ended badly. We didn't speak for a week after that. During that week, I did something I hadn't done in years. I took a hard look at my finances. I always told myself I was bad with money, which was just an excuse for my impulsive spending. I calculated how much I spent each month on things that were part of the game. The coffees, the brunches, the trendy clothes I wore once, the subscription boxes, the ride-sharing services because I was too impatient for public transit. The total was sickening. It was a huge chunk of my income, all going towards maintaining an image. I thought of Fisher, the intense guy standing in front of his stock charts. He was taking money and turning it into more money. I was taking money and turning it into disposable experiences and depreciating assets. I saw an ad online for a personal finance workshop, a free introductory session. On a whim, I signed up. I went that weekend. The room was full of people like me, people who had woken up one day and realized they were running on a hamster wheel. The instructor talked about the difference between assets and liabilities, about building systems for wealth instead of just trading time for money. It wasn't rocket science, but it was presented in a way that finally clicked. It was the same philosophy Dorian and his friends were applying to their entire lives. Build a solid foundation first. The final break with Anais happened a few days later. She posted a meme on her social media. It was one of those generic ones, a picture of a lioness with a caption like, "A queen is not afraid to walk alone because she knows the jungle is more afraid of her." But in the comments section, she wrote a long tirade. She didn't use names, but it was obviously about Dorian and his friends. She wrote about men who were too weak to handle a strong woman, so they ran away to their little clubhouses to cry together. She called them man babies and said that their supposed self-improvement was just a mask for their deep-seated insecurity and hatred of women. It was vicious, and it was dishonest. It wasn't just an opinion anymore. It was a deliberate attempt to malign them, to paint them as villains to her online followers. I couldn't let it go. I called her. I didn't yell. I was calm. I asked her why she was so obsessed with them, why she felt the need to publicly tear them down when they were just living their lives and not bothering anyone. They are bothering people, she shot back. They're a threat. What if all men decided to do that? Just check out? Who would be left to build society, to support families? And then the real truth came out. They're supposed to be trying to win us over, she said, her voice cracking with a strange mix of anger and desperation. They're supposed to want our approval. That's how it works. By refusing to play, they're spitting in our faces. They're saying we're not worth the effort. There it was, the raw, unfiltered core of her anger. It wasn't about social justice or toxic masculinity. It was about power. She, and women like her, were used to being the gatekeepers of male validation. Their approval was the prize. Dorian and his friends had simply declared that the prize wasn't worth the cost of the game, and in doing so, they had taken away her power. Their success, their happiness, their peace, all achieved without her permission, was an existential threat to her worldview. If men could be happy and successful without them, then what was their leverage? I finally understood. I told her I couldn't be a part of that anymore, that her worldview was based on needing men to be weak so she could feel strong. She called me a traitor, and that was the last time we ever spoke. Losing a best friend hurts, but the relief I felt afterward was profound. It was like I had been carrying a heavy weight for years without even realizing it. My life is different now. It's quieter. I deleted the dating apps. I muted most of my social media. I started a budget and an investment account. I moved into a smaller, cheaper apartment. I started using the extra money and time to learn new skills. I'm taking an online course in project management. I started learning how to cook properly instead of relying on takeout. I'm building things, small things, a savings account, a new skill set, a sense of peace. I'm not a man. I'm not going my own way in the same sense they are. But I did learn something from them. I learned that the only way to win the game is to stop playing. You have to build your own foundation. You have to create your own value. You have to define your own success. I never saw Dorian or his friends again. I have no idea what they're doing now, but I have a feeling they're doing just fine. They were the antagonists of the story Aeneas and I told ourselves. But in the end, they were just the catalyst for my own. They showed me the cage, and I was the one who had to find the courage to open the door. I'm still building my foundation, but for the first time in a long time, it feels solid under my feet.